Some things stay in our lives long after they've stopped helping us, not because we choose them, not because we want them, but because we've carried them for so long. They start feeling like part of who we are. Old fears, old stories, old wounds, old versions of ourselves. The strange thing is, most people don't realize what they're carrying, not at first, because emotional weight becomes familiar, and familiar things stop attracting attention. You stop noticing the sadness, the fear, the limitations, the pain, not because they're gone, because they've become normal. And maybe that's why you're here tonight, not to discover something new, but to notice something old, something you've been carrying longer than necessary, something that's quietly asking to be released. So don't think too hard, don't analyze, don't compare, just notice which window keeps pulling your attention back, because sometimes what we're ready to leave behind reveals itself before we're ready to explain it. Take a breath and choose. Window 1. Old sadness. If this window pulled your attention first, I don't think your heart is holding on to a person. I think it's holding on to a feeling, because sadness rarely stays attached to one event forever. Over time, it attaches itself to memories, places, songs, moments, versions of ourselves. And maybe there's a part of your life you still visit emotionally. Not every day, not constantly, just enough to remind yourself what happened, enough to wonder how things could have been different, enough to keep a quiet connection to something that's already gone. And honestly, most people don't realize they're doing this. They think they're remembering, when really, they're revisiting. There's a difference. Remembering allows life to continue. Revisiting keeps part of you emotionally parked in the same place. Maybe there was a chapter that meant more to you than most people know. A relationship, a friendship, a dream, a version of your life, a version of yourself, something that felt important, something that felt real, something that felt like it would last longer. And even though time has passed, part of you still turns around occasionally, just to look at it, not because you want to go back, but because something still hurts. The strange thing about sadness is that it doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like nostalgia. Sometimes it feels like longing. Sometimes it feels like silence. Sometimes it feels like emotional distance. Sometimes it feels like a heaviness you can't quite explain. And maybe you've felt that lately. The sensation that something inside you still hasn't fully moved on. Not because you're weak, not because you're broken, because you're human. Humans become attached, not only to people, to meanings, to possibilities, to futures they imagined. And sometimes, the future we imagined becomes harder to release than the thing we actually lost. Maybe that's what this window is showing you. Not a person, not an event, a possibility, a version of life you once believed in. And honestly, those losses can be surprisingly difficult to heal, because there is no funeral for a possibility, no ceremony, no clear ending, just a slow realization that life moved somewhere else. And maybe that's why part of you still looks through this window, because some part of you is still waiting, still wondering, still asking questions reality can no longer answer. But here's something important. Sadness is not always asking to be solved. Sometimes it's asking to be acknowledged. Sometimes healing begins, not when we stop feeling sad, but when we stop pretending we aren't. Maybe there are experiences you rushed past, pain you minimized, disappointments you never gave yourself permission to grieve, because life kept moving, responsibilities kept arriving, people expected things from you, And somewhere in the middle of surviving, you never stopped long enough to fully process what happened. And honestly, that happens more often than people realize. Many adults are carrying grief. They never had time to feel properly, so they keep functioning, keep working, keep smiling, keep moving, while part of their emotional world remains frozen in an earlier chapter. Maybe that's why this rainy window feels familiar, because rain slows things down. It changes the atmosphere. It asks people to pause, to stay inside, to listen, and maybe your heart wants the same thing. Maybe it wants a moment of honesty, a moment where you stop pretending you're completely over something, a moment where you admit that certain experiences changed you, that certain losses mattered, that certain endings still echo quietly inside you, because denying sadness doesn't make it disappear. It only forces it underground. And emotions buried underground have a way of shaping our lives from the shadows. They influence relationships, choices, boundaries, expectations, without us even realizing it. And perhaps that's why this window appeared tonight. Not because you're meant to stay sad, because you're meant to stop carrying sadness unconsciously. There is a difference. One keeps you trapped. The other creates freedom, because what we acknowledge loses its need to hide, and what no longer hides can finally begin to heal. Maybe the chapter you're grieving deserves compassion. Maybe the version of you who lived through it deserves compassion too. Not judgment, not criticism, not pressure to be over it. Compassion, because healing isn't a race. And grief doesn't follow schedules. It moves when it's ready, not when people expect it to, not when logic demands it, when it's ready. And perhaps the reason this window called to you is because your heart is tired of carrying yesterday without ever speaking its name. Maybe you're becoming ready to stop revisiting and start remembering instead. To stop living inside the sadness and start honoring it, because there is a difference between carrying a memory and becoming trapped inside one. And maybe that's what you're ready to leave behind. Not the memory, not the love, not the meaning, just the weight, the unnecessary weight you've carried long enough. And maybe tonight, for the first time in a while, your heart is finally beginning to set it down. Window 2. Fear of uncertainty. If this window pulled your attention first, I don't think you're afraid of failure. I think you're tired of not knowing. Because uncertainty creates a very specific kind of exhaustion. Not the exhaustion that comes from effort, the exhaustion that comes from waiting. Waiting for answers, waiting for clarity, waiting for signs, waiting for something to finally make sense. And maybe that's where you've been living lately, in between. Not fully here, not fully there, standing at the edge of a chapter that hasn't revealed itself yet. And honestly, few things challenge the human heart more than uncertainty, because uncertainty asks us to move forward without guarantees, without proof, without complete understanding. And most people hate that, not because they're weak, because they're human. The mind wants certainty. It wants predictions. It wants control. It wants to know what happens next. But life rarely offers those things. Instead, life often gives us fog, a path we can only see a few steps ahead. And maybe that's exactly what this frozen window represents. The frustration of not being able to see clearly, the fear of moving without knowing, the discomfort of standing in a place where answers refuse to arrive. Maybe there's something in your life right now that feels unresolved, a relationship, a decision, a dream, a future plan, a question you've been carrying, something important enough that your mind keeps returning to it, trying to figure it out, trying to solve it, trying to force clarity from uncertainty. And maybe that's becoming exhausting, because there comes a point when thinking no longer creates answers. It only creates more thinking, more scenarios, more possibilities, more worries, more imagined futures. And before long, you find yourself trapped inside a conversation with your own mind, one that never actually ends. Maybe you've noticed this, how uncertainty makes people rehearse life. They imagine outcomes, conversations, failures, rejections, successes, disappointments, over and over, as if preparation can somehow eliminate risk, as if enough thinking can protect us from pain. But life doesn't work that way. And deep down, I think you know that. I think part of you already understands that certainty is not coming, at least not yet. And maybe that's the real lesson hidden inside this window. Not how to find certainty, how to live without it. Because confidence is often misunderstood. People think confidence means knowing, but many times, confidence means moving without knowing, trusting yourself without guarantees, continuing without proof. And honestly, that kind of confidence is much harder to build because it requires surrender, not giving up. Surrender, the willingness to stop fighting reality, the willingness to admit that some questions cannot be answered today, the willingness to let the future remain the future without dragging it into the present every 5 minutes. And maybe that's what your heart is tired of. Not uncertainty itself, the constant battle against it, the constant need to know, the constant search for reassurance, the constant effort to feel safe. Because the truth is, even when people get answers, they often discover new questions. Even when one uncertainty disappears, another one arrives. Life has always been uncertain. The difference is that sometimes we accept it, and sometimes we resist it. Maybe you've been resisting it for a while now, trying to force clarity, trying to force decisions, trying to force understanding, trying to force timing. And maybe none of those things can be forced. Maybe clarity arrives the same way frost melts, gradually, quietly, naturally, not because you demanded it, because the conditions finally changed. Think about how many answers in your life arrived after you stopped chasing them. How many realizations appeared unexpectedly? How many chapters eventually made sense without being forced? How many fears disappeared simply because time moved forward? Life has done this before, many times, and somehow you survived every uncertain chapter you've already lived through, even the ones that felt impossible, even the ones that kept you awake, even the ones that convinced you everything might fall apart. You're still here, maybe not unchanged, but still here, and perhaps that deserves more trust than you're giving it, because uncertainty often makes people forget their own resilience. They become so focused on what they don't know that they forget everything they've already overcome. They become so focused on the fog ahead that they stop noticing the road behind them, the evidence that they've navigated uncertainty before, the evidence that they've adapted before, the evidence that they've survived before. Maybe that's why this window appeared tonight, not to show you what's coming, to remind you of something you've forgotten, that you don't need complete certainty to move forward. You never did. You only needed enough courage for the next step. And maybe that's still true. Maybe your future doesn't need to be fully visible. Maybe your answers don't need to arrive tonight. Maybe your life isn't asking for certainty right now. Maybe it's asking for trust. Trust in your ability to adapt. Trust in your ability to learn. Trust in your ability to survive whatever comes next. Because uncertainty is not always a threat. Sometimes it's simply the space where life hasn't introduced itself yet. And perhaps the thing you're ready to leave behind isn't the uncertainty. It's the belief that you cannot move forward until uncertainty disappears. Because it won't. Not completely, but your fear of it can. And maybe that's exactly what this frozen window came to show you tonight. Window 3. Old limitations. If this window pulled your attention first, I don't think you're being held back by reality. I think you're being held back by a story you've repeated so many times that it started sounding like truth. Maybe you've carried it for years, maybe longer. The story that says you're too late, too old, too damaged, too different, too behind, too much, not enough. The details change, but the feeling remains the same, a quiet belief that something about you makes certain things impossible. And honestly, most limitations don't begin in the outside world. They begin in the inner world. Because before people stop themselves physically, they stop themselves mentally. Before they refuse opportunities, they imagine failure. Before they try, they predict disappointment. Before they move, they convince themselves not to. And after enough repetition, those thoughts stop sounding like fear. They start sounding like facts. Maybe you've experienced this. A dream appears, an idea appears, a possibility appears, and almost immediately, another voice arrives, the voice that explains why it won't work, why now isn't the right time, why someone else could do it better, why you should be realistic, why you should lower expectations, why you shouldn't get your hopes up. And perhaps that voice has protected you for a long time, because fear often disguises itself as wisdom. It says, don't risk disappointment, don't risk embarrassment, don't risk failure, don't risk getting hurt again. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable, but eventually, protection becomes limitation. The walls become a prison, the armor becomes heavy, the survival strategy outlives the danger. And maybe that's what's happening now. Maybe the thing holding you back isn't what's in front of you, it's what's behind you. Old experiences, old failures, old rejections, old disappointments, moments that taught you to become smaller, more careful, more cautious, less hopeful. Because pain teaches lessons, sometimes useful lessons, sometimes unnecessary ones. And unfortunately, the heart rarely knows the difference. If something hurt enough, the heart remembers. It creates rules, invisible rules. Rules like, don't trust too quickly, don't dream too big, don't expect too much, don't believe too easily, don't try unless success is guaranteed. And maybe those rules helped you survive. But survival and living are not the same thing, because survival focuses on avoiding pain. Living focuses on experiencing life. And eventually, those two paths begin moving in different directions. Maybe that's why this window is open, not broken, not damaged, open, because something inside you is becoming ready, ready to question old assumptions, ready to challenge old stories, ready to consider possibilities that once felt impossible. And honestly, that can be frightening, because freedom sounds exciting until it becomes real. When freedom becomes real, it creates responsibility. If the door is open, you have to decide whether to walk through it. If the window's open, you have to decide whether to look outside. And maybe part of you isn't afraid of failure. Maybe part of you is afraid of possibility, afraid that life could become bigger than the identity you've built around your limitations, because limitations can become comfortable, predictable, safe. If you expect less, you risk less disappointment. If you dream less, you risk less heartbreak. If you try less, you risk less failure. But you also risk something else, a smaller life, a life shaped by fear instead of truth. And maybe your heart is beginning to feel that difference. Maybe that's why this window called you. Not because everything is possible, because more is possible than you've been allowing yourself to believe. Maybe the chapter you're entering requires a different version of you, a version less interested in protection, a version more interested in honesty. Because the truth is, many of the limits we live inside were built years ago by younger versions of ourselves, versions that were scared, versions that were hurt, versions that were doing their best. But those versions are not living your life today. You are. And maybe their fears don't need to become your future. Maybe their wounds don't need to become your identity. Maybe their limitations don't need to become your reality, because every meaningful change begins with the same realization. The door was never locked. The window was never closed. You were simply looking at it through old eyes, and perhaps that's the thing you're ready to leave behind. Not caution, not wisdom, not realism. The old belief that your future must be limited by your past, because it doesn't, not unless you keep choosing it. And maybe tonight, for the first time in a long time, you're beginning to imagine something larger, something wider, something brighter, something waiting on the other side of the window you've been afraid to open. And maybe that's exactly where your next chapter begins. Window 4. The pain you've outgrown. If this window pulled your attention first, I don't think this is about the pain itself. I think it's about the person you became because of it. Because pain changes people, not always dramatically, sometimes quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you've been living according to rules you never consciously chose. Rules created by old wounds, old disappointments, old betrayals, old fears. And maybe those rules made sense once. Maybe they protected you. Maybe they helped you survive a difficult chapter. Maybe they kept you safe when safety was hard to find. But survival creates habits, and sometimes those habits remain long after the danger is gone. That's the difficult thing about emotional pain. The event ends. The wound heals. The years pass. But the protective behaviors often stay. Not because they're needed, because they're familiar. Maybe you've experienced this. You hesitate when you want to trust. You pull away when you want connection. You expect disappointment before it arrives. You prepare for rejection before anyone rejects you. You guard yourself automatically, not because the present moment requires it, because the past trained you to. And honestly, most people don't realize how much of their life is still being influenced by old pain. Pain becomes identity. Pain becomes personality. Pain becomes perspective. Pain becomes expectation. Without permission, without awareness, without being questioned. And maybe that's what this broken window represents. Not damage, not weakness, not something wrong with you, something that once broke, but no longer defines you. Because look closely, the glass is cracked. but light still enters. The wound exists, but the world continues. The damage happened, but life didn't stop. And maybe that's the truth. Your heart has been trying to show you. You survived something, maybe several things. Things that changed you, things that forced you to grow, things that made you stronger. But somewhere along the way, you started confusing survival with identity. You started believing that the person created by the pain was the real you, the cautious version, the guarded version, the emotionally prepared version, the version always expecting the next disappointment, the version always watching for danger, the version always ready for loss. And perhaps that version helped you once, but does it still help you now? That's the question. Not whether your pain was real. It was. Not whether your wounds mattered. They did. Not whether those experiences changed you. Of course they did. The question is, do they still deserve control over your future? Because there comes a moment in healing when the pain is no longer the problem. The attachment to the pain becomes the problem. The identity built around it becomes the problem. The story becomes the problem. And maybe that's difficult to hear, because pain can become familiar, and familiar things feel safe, even when they're limiting us, even when they're exhausting us, even when they're keeping us from fully living. Sometimes people become attached to their wounds because the wounds explain everything. Why they struggle, why they hesitate, why they stay small, why they don't trust, why they don't try, why they don't move forward. And honestly, letting go of those explanations can feel terrifying, because if the wound is no longer controlling your life, then who are you now? If the pain no longer defines you, what comes next? If the old story ends, what story replaces it? And maybe that's exactly where you are, standing at the edge of a new chapter, not because everything is healed, because something inside you is finally becoming stronger than the wound, stronger than the fear, stronger than the old identity, stronger than the version of yourself created by survival. And perhaps that's why this window appeared tonight, not to remind you of the pain, to remind you how far you've already come, because maybe you've been measuring yourself incorrectly. Maybe you've been looking at what still hurts instead of noticing what you've already survived. Maybe you've been focusing on what's missing instead of recognizing what you've become. Because growth is strange. It happens slowly, quietly, without announcements, without dramatic music, without obvious milestones, until one day you respond differently, you think differently, you choose differently, you live differently, and suddenly the wound no longer feels like home. And maybe that's where healing truly begins, not when pain disappears. When pain stops being your identity, when you stop introducing yourself through your scars, when you stop building your future around your fears, when you stop expecting yesterday to repeat itself forever, because yesterday is not your future. It never was. And perhaps the thing you're ready to leave behind isn't the pain, it's the version of yourself that believes the pain still owns you, because it doesn't, not anymore. Maybe none of these windows were random. Maybe each one revealed something you've been carrying for longer than necessary. A sadness, a fear, a limitation, a wound. Not because you wanted to, because you learned how, because life taught you, because survival required it. And maybe, for a long time, those things protected you. Maybe they helped you make it through difficult years. Maybe they helped you become the person you are today. But not everything that protects us forever serves us forever. Some things are meant to be outgrown. Some things are meant to be released. Some things are meant to remain in the past, not because they weren't important, because they completed their purpose. And perhaps that's what tonight was really about. Not discovery, recognition, recognizing what no longer belongs in your future, recognizing what you've already outgrown, recognizing the weight you're finally ready to set down. Because healing isn't always about adding something new. Sometimes it's about carrying less fear, less guilt, less pressure, less pain, less of the stories that no longer fit the person you're becoming. And maybe that's enough for tonight. You don't have to force change. You don't have to rush healing. You don't have to figure everything out before morning. Just notice. Notice what felt familiar. Notice what felt uncomfortable. Notice what felt true. Because sometimes the things that pull our attention are quietly pointing toward the things we're ready to leave behind. Maybe the thing you've been trying to release has been releasing you too. Good night.